The sky over the South Atlantic is the colour of wet slate. It is the first week of May 1982, and a young Argentine pilot, let us imagine him, because dozens like him lived this exact moment, is pushing his Dassault Mirage 3 through the cloud at better than the speed of sound. He has the advantage. He has been told he has the advantage. His aircraft is faster than anything the British have brought south, sleeker, born of French engineering and designed to scream across the sky and leave its enemies clawing at empty air. The intelligence briefings were clear. The Sea Harrier is a curiosity, a toy, a vertical takeoff novelty cobbled together because the Royal Navy could no longer afford proper aircraft carriers. It cannot outrun him. It cannot outclimb him. In a straight fight, the physics are simple and the physics are on his side. And then the impossible happens. The British aircraft ahead of him, the one he has been closing on with the certainty of a hawk on a pigeon, simply stops. Not slows, stops, as though the air itself has reached out and seized it. One moment it fills his gun sight. The next it has dropped behind him and he has overshot. And now the hunter is the hunted. The cockpit warning tone he never expected begins to shriek. Behind and below him, a Sidewinder missile is already leaving its rail. He has just encountered Viffing, vectoring in forward flight. 4 words, an acronym, VIFF, that would pass into the folklore of the Falklands War and into the nightmares of the Fuerza Aérea Argentina. The trick was almost absurdly simple in concept. The Sea Harrier could swivel the nozzles that normally pointed its jet thrust backwards and aim them downwards or even forwards in the middle of a dogfight. The result was an aircraft that could brake in midair, pitch its nose up violently, or shed speed so fast that any pursuer would sail helplessly past. No conventional fighter on Earth could do it, and in 1982, 8,000 miles from home, with no airbase to retreat to and no second chances, a few dozen Royal Navy pilots were about to use it to defend the honour and the territory of a nation that half the world had already written off. How did Britain end up here? How did a country that had spent the better part of 2 decades dismantling its global military reach, scrapping its carriers, and quietly preparing to abandon the South Atlantic altogether, suddenly find itself fighting a full-blown air and sea war at the very bottom of the world? And how did an aircraft that Whitehall's own accountants had nearly cancelled, an aircraft mocked as a compromise and a stopgap, become the instrument that saved a task force and humbled a hostile air force? The answer is a story of arrogance and improvisation, of political desperation in Downing Street and extraordinary courage in the cockpit. It is a story about a manoeuvre that, depending on whom you ask, was either the decisive trick of the air war or a myth that grew in the telling. And it is, above all, a story about what happens when a declining power is forced, suddenly, violently, and without warning, to discover whether it still has any fight left in it at all. To understand why those Argentine pilots came to fear the strange little jet that could stop in midair, we have to go back. Back before the missiles, before the landings at San Carlos, before Margaret Thatcher stood at the dispatch box and committed a nation to war. We have to understand the Britain of 1982, a Britain that by any reasonable measure should never have been able to fight this war at all. To grasp what the Sea Harrier achieved, you must first understand how very nearly it never went to war at all, and how very nearly Britain itself had abandoned the means to fight. By the early 1980s, the Royal Navy was a service in managed decline. The great fleet carriers that had once projected British power from Suez to Singapore were gone, victims of the 1966 Defence White Paper that had cancelled the CVA-01 carrier programme and quietly conceded that Britain could no longer afford to be a global naval power. The logic in Whitehall was brutal, but, on its own terms, coherent. Britain's defence priority was the North Atlantic and the Central Front in Germany. The threat was Soviet, the theatre was European, and the Royal Navy's job was to hunt Soviet submarines under NATO command, not to sail off on imperial adventures. Anti-submarine helicopters mattered. Strike aircraft, launched from proper carriers, did not. The result was a fleet built around small ships with a deeply unfashionable name. They were called through-deck cruisers, a piece of bureaucratic sleight of hand designed to disguise the fact that they were, in plain English, aircraft carriers, a word the Treasury had effectively banned. HMS Invincible and HMS Hermes were never meant to fight a war for sovereign territory in the South Atlantic. They were meant to shepherd helicopters around the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, watching for Soviet boats. And in early 1982, even these were being given away. The Nott Review, John Nott was Mrs. Thatcher's defence secretary, had concluded that the surface fleet should be cut still further. Invincible was to be sold to Australia. The amphibious assault ships Fearless and Intrepid were for the scrapyard. The ice patrol vessel HMS Endurance, Britain's only permanent naval presence in Antarctic waters, was to be withdrawn. A decision the Argentine junta read, not unreasonably, as a signal that Britain no longer cared about the Falklands at all. This was the strategic backdrop. A nation in retreat. An empire that had shrunk from a quarter of the globe to a scattering of remote dependencies. A Royal Navy being salami-sliced by accountants. And a Conservative government, deeply unpopular at home, presiding over mass unemployment and riots in the cities, with a Prime Minister whose poll ratings had sunk to the lowest of any premier in the history of opinion polling. In Buenos Aires, the calculation was simple. The military junta, led by General Leopoldo Galtieri, was itself in trouble. Its economy in ruins, its people restless, its regime stained by the dirty war against its own citizens. A short, victorious war to reclaim Las Malvinas, the islands Argentina had claimed since 1833, would unite the nation behind the generals. And the British, surely, would not fight. Why would they? They were giving away their carriers. They were withdrawing their ships. They had spent 20 years telling anyone who would listen that they could no longer police the far corners of the world. What the junta failed to understand, what almost everyone failed to understand, was that the very weapon Whitehall had nearly thrown away would prove its salvation. The Sea Harrier, the compromise aircraft, the jump jet that purists sneered at, had entered Fleet Air Arm Service only in 1980. There were barely enough of them. They were unproven in combat, and they would shortly be asked to win command of the air over a hostile ocean against an enemy with 3 times their numbers, with no airfield to land on and no help coming. The question was whether a handful of these strange aircraft and the men who flew them could do the impossible. The Sea Harrier was the product of a peculiarly British genius for making a virtue out of necessity. Its origins lay in the 1960s with Hawker Siddeley and a revolutionary engine, the Bristol Pegasus, which did something no other production engine could. It directed its thrust through 4 rotating nozzles. Swivel the nozzles down and the aircraft rose vertically. Swivel them back and it flew forwards like any other jet. The result was the Harrier, the world's first practical vertical and short takeoff and landing combat aircraft, an engineering marvel that the rest of the world admired and, tellingly, never quite managed to copy. But the path to the South Atlantic was littered with near cancellations. The RAF had its Harriers for ground attack in Germany. The naval version, the Sea Harrier FRA, S1, fitted with radar and air-to-air missiles, had been a hard sell. Treasury officials questioned why the Navy needed fixed-wing aircraft at all. It was approved in 1975 in modest numbers, and the men who would fly it operationally were, by April 1982, a small and tight-knit fraternity. The Fleet Air Arm could muster only around 20 Sea Harriers fit for the South Atlantic. Against them, the Argentine Air Forces could field perhaps 200 combat aircraft, including supersonic Mirages, American-built Skyhawks, and the deadly French Super Étendards carrying Exocet missiles. The man who would command the Sea Harriers aboard Hermes was Lieutenant Commander Andy Auld, leading 800 Naval Air Squadron. Aboard Invincible, 801 Squadron was led by Lieutenant Commander Nigel Sharkey Ward. A fierce, opinionated advocate for the aircraft who had spent years arguing against considerable Whitehall skepticism that the Sea Harrier could more than hold its own. Ward would become one of the war's most controversial and compelling figures, a true believer who insisted the jet's detractors had simply never understood what it could do. On April 2nd, 1982, the argument became academic. Argentine forces landed on the Falklands and overwhelmed the tiny garrison of Royal Marines. The Union flag came down over Government House in Port Stanley. In London, the news landed like a thunderclap. Mrs. Thatcher's response was immediate and uncompromising. Within days, a task force was assembled and sailed south, an extraordinary feat of improvisation involving requisitioned merchant ships, the great liners Canberra and Queen Elizabeth II, and the two small carriers that the government had so recently been planning to dispose of. The First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Henry Leach, had told the Prime Minister plainly that a task force could be assembled and that it must be, for if Britain did not respond, he warned, she would soon be living in a different country, one whose word counted for nothing. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, resigned, taking responsibility for the diplomatic failure to anticipate the invasion. The diplomatic machinery whirred. The United Nations, the Americans under Alexander Haig, shuttling between capitals. But the ships were already steaming south at speed, and aboard Hermes and Invincible, the Sea Harrier pilots were running through their procedures, studying recognition silhouettes of Mirages and Skyhawks, and confronting an uncomfortable arithmetic. They were outnumbered. They were outranged in a straight chase. Their aircraft was untested in combat. What they had, though, was something the enemy did not understand and could not replicate. They had an aircraft that did not obey the normal rules of air combat, and a handful of men who had spent years working out exactly how to exploit that fact when the shooting finally started. The first hard truth of the air war was geography, and geography was almost entirely against the British. The Argentine mainland air bases lay roughly 400 miles from the Falklands. For a Mirage or a Skyhawk, that distance was punishing. By the time these aircraft reached the islands and the British fleet beyond, they had precious little fuel for the high-speed, high-energy manoeuvring that air combat demands. They could make perhaps one firing pass, maybe two, and then they had to turn for home or risk falling into the sea. The Argentine pilots, and many were skilled and brave men, were fighting at the very edge of their range. This single fact would shape everything. The Sea Harriers, by contrast, were defending. They flew combat air patrols close to the fleet they protected, loitering, conserving fuel, waiting. When the enemy arrived, low on fuel and unable to linger, the British could choose their moment. And crucially, the Sea Harrier carried a weapon that would prove decisive. The latest AIM-9L Sidewinder missile, an all-aspect heat seeker supplied with quiet urgency by the Americans. The practical face of the special relationship, expedited by Defence Secretary Caspar Weinberger, who was instinctively pro-British throughout the crisis. Earlier, Sidewinders could only home in on an enemy's hot exhaust from behind. The L model could be fired from almost any angle. It changed the mathematics of every engagement. But the Argentines did not yet know how good the British missiles were, nor how the Sea Harrier flew. They were still operating on assumptions. And the most dangerous assumption of all was that their supersonic Mirages held the whip hand. The reckoning came on May 1st, 1982. The British had announced a total exclusion zone around the islands, and now they meant to enforce it. RAF Vulcan bombers, flying one of the longest bombing raids in history from Ascension Island, struck the runway at Port Stanley in the audacious Black Buck operations. The Sea Harriers struck airfields too, and the Argentine Air Force, stung and surprised, launched its fighters to sweep the British from the sky. That day, the Mirages came out to play, and the myth of their superiority began to crack. In the engagements that followed, Sea Harriers flown by Fleet Air Arm pilots dropped Argentine aircraft from the sky and lost none of their own in air-to-air combat. The all-aspect Sidewinders proved murderously effective, and the Argentine pilots discovered, to their horror, that the slow, ungainly jump jet they had been told to despise was in fact a vicious and unpredictable opponent, one that could turn tighter, fight smarter, and, when it chose, perform manoeuvres that defied everything they had been taught about aerial combat. It was here that the legend of Viffing took root. Whether or not it was used as widely as the stories later claimed, and that remains a genuine matter of debate among historians and the pilots themselves. The mere possibility transformed Argentine tactics. If a pursued Sea Harrier could suddenly stop dead in the air and let you overshoot into its gun sight, then chasing one became a deadly gamble. Pilots who might once have pressed home an attack now hesitated. Hesitation, in air combat, is fatal. The psychological war had been won before the physical one was decided. The Argentines had come south certain of their advantage in the air. Within days, that certainty was gone, replaced by a creeping dread of an aircraft that did not behave the way aircraft were supposed to behave, flown by men who seemed entirely unafraid. But the hardest fighting and the heaviest losses were still to come. The defining drama of the air war unfolded not in graceful duels between fighters, but in the desperate, screaming chaos of low-level attacks against the British fleet. And it was here that the Sea Harrier earned its place in history. Once the British landed their ground forces at San Carlos Water on May 21st, the Royal Navy was forced to do the one thing it least wanted: sit, anchored and exposed in a confined stretch of water while troops and stores went ashore. The Argentine pilots seized their chance. Wave after wave of Skyhawks and daggers came howling in at wave-top height, jinking through the hills of East Falkland, releasing their bombs at point-blank range against the warships crowded into the anchorage that the sailors grimly nicknamed Bomb Alley. For the Sea Harrier pilots, this was the supreme test. They could not be everywhere. With barely 20 aircraft to cover an entire fleet, they flew themselves to exhaustion, multiple sorties a day, refueling, rearming, launching again into the grey murk. They positioned themselves on the likely approach routes and fell upon the attackers as they ran in or pulled away. The combat was fast, brutal, and astonishingly close to the sea. A pilot might roll in behind a Skyhawk only feet above the water, loose a Sidewinder, and watch it strike home in a ball of flame before hauling his own aircraft up to avoid the spray. This was where the Harrier's unique flying qualities mattered most. The ability to decelerate hard, to fly slowly and stay in the fight rather than blasting past at high speed, allowed the British pilots to engage targets that a conventional fighter would have overshot in an instant. Whether they were swiveling their nozzles in the classic Viffing manoeuvre or simply exploiting the aircraft's extraordinary low-speed handling, the effect was the same. The Sea Harrier could fight in a regime where its opponents could not follow. The cost to the Argentine air arm was severe. Over the course of the campaign, Sea Harriers destroyed more than 20 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, the great majority falling to the all-aspect Sidewinder, for the loss of not a single Sea Harrier to an enemy fighter. The aircraft that were lost, and several were, fell to ground fire, to accidents, to the merciless weather of the South Atlantic, but never to an Argentine pilot in a dogfight. Yet the bravery of the Argentine airmen must not be understated. They pressed home their attacks through a wall of fire with a courage that British sailors openly acknowledged and respected. They sank ships. HMS Ardent, HMS Antelope, HMS Coventry, all went down under air attack. The destroyer, HMS Sheffield, was struck by an air-launched Exocet missile and lost, a blow that stunned the nation watching at home. The container ship Atlantic Conveyor, carrying vital helicopters, was lost to another Exocet. Each loss was a wound, and each was felt keenly in a Britain glued to the evening news. But the central fact remained. The Argentine Air Force, for all its courage, could not win command of the air. It could not drive off the Sea Harriers, and without command of the air, it could not stop the British landing, reinforcing, and advancing across the islands towards Port Stanley. The jump jet that Whitehall had nearly cancelled, flown from carriers that the Treasury had tried to disguise as cruisers, had achieved precisely what the doubters said it never could. The men who flew it had not merely survived. They had prevailed, and they had done so against the longest of odds, at the very limit of human and mechanical endurance, 8,000 miles from home. Victory in the air did not come without grief, and it would be a betrayal of the truth to dwell only on triumph. The Falklands War cost Britain dearly, and the price was paid in lives, in ships, and in hard lessons that the Royal Navy would not soon forget. 255 British servicemen and women died in the South Atlantic. The Argentine dead numbered around 649, many of them young conscripts, and many lost in a single catastrophic moment when the cruiser A.R.A. General Belgrano was torpedoed by the submarine HMS Conqueror, with the loss of 323 lives. An action that remains, 4 decades on, among the most fiercely debated decisions of the entire war. For the Sea Harrier force specifically, the losses were sobering. Of the small number of aircraft committed, several were lost. To accidents, to atrocious flying weather, to ground fire during attack missions, pilots died. The margins were impossibly thin. Had the British lost just a handful more of their precious jets, the entire air defence of the fleet might have unravelled. There was no reserve. There was no replacement waiting at a nearby base. Every Sea Harrier was, quite literally, irreplaceable for the duration of the campaign. The loss of HMS Sheffield to a single Exocet exposed an uncomfortable truth that Whitehall and the Royal Navy had been slow to confront. The fleet's air defences against sea-skimming missiles were dangerously inadequate. The Sea Harriers could contest the sky against enemy aircraft, but they could not reliably stop a missile launched from beyond visual range by a super-étendard that turned for home before it could be engaged. The Royal Navy learned, brutally and in real time, that controlling the air was not the same as controlling the threat. And that lesson would drive procurement decisions for a generation. There was a deeper lesson too. one that struck at the heart of the assumptions of the 1981 Knot Review. The entire premise of that review, that Britain needed no significant carrier-borne air power, that the surface fleet could be cut, that ships like Invincible and Endurance were luxuries, had been tested in war and found dangerously wrong. The very capabilities that had been marked for the scrapyard turned out to be the ones that saved the campaign. Had the cuts been implemented just a year earlier, Britain might have lacked the carriers and the aircraft to fight at all. The Falklands was won, in part, by a margin of timing that was almost entirely a matter of luck. The political cost, by contrast, fell almost entirely upon the losing side. In Buenos Aires, the defeat shattered the credibility of the junta. Galtieri was forced from power within days of the surrender, and the military regime that had ruled Argentina through years of terror collapsed soon after, opening the way to the return of democracy. The generals had gambled that a foreign war would save them at home. Instead, it destroyed them, a lesson in the dangers of using patriotism as a substitute for legitimacy. And for the Argentine pilots themselves, the survivors carried home a hard-won and rueful respect for the strange British aircraft and the men who flew it. They had been told the Sea Harrier was a joke. They had learned otherwise in the harshest classroom imaginable. The fear those pilots felt, fear of an aircraft that could stop in the air, fear of a missile that could find them from any angle, fear of an enemy who simply would not be beaten in the sky, was real, and it was earned. What remained was to reckon with what it all meant. The recapture of the Falklands transformed Britain's sense of itself almost overnight, and the consequences rippled outward through politics, defence, and the nation's standing in the world. For Margaret Thatcher, the victory was nothing short of political resurrection. The Prime Minister, who had entered 1982 as the most unpopular premier in polling history, emerged from the war transfigured. The Iron Lady, the leader who had stared down a foreign aggressor and won. The Falklands factor carried her to a landslide general election victory in 1983 and reshaped the politics of the decade. Whatever one thinks of her, the verdict of the ballot box was unambiguous. A nation that had spent years anxious about decline had been reminded suddenly and dramatically that it could still act decisively on the world stage. For the Royal Navy and for British defence policy, the lessons were absorbed quickly and at considerable expense. The Knot Review's cuts were quietly reversed where they touched the capabilities the war had vindicated. HMS Invincible was not, after all, sold to Australia. The carriers stayed. The amphibious ships were reprieved. The Sea Harrier, so nearly cancelled and so thoroughly vindicated, was upgraded into the much improved FA2 variant, with a far better radar and the medium-range AMRAAM missile, serving on into the new century. The hard lesson of the Exocet drove urgent investment in fleet air defence and electronic countermeasures. The war also reaffirmed, in its own way, the value of the special relationship, though it revealed its limits too. The Americans had performed a delicate balancing act, publicly attempting to mediate between two allies, whilst privately providing Britain with crucial assistance: the latest Sidewinder missiles, fuel and supplies at Ascension Island, satellite intelligence, and the quiet sympathy of key figures in Washington. Caspar Weinberger was later honoured by the Crown for his role. Yet the episode also reminded Whitehall that American interests in Latin America did not always align with British ones, and that even the closest of allies would calculate coldly when it suited them. Internationally, the message was heard clearly. Britain had demonstrated that she retained the will and, just barely, the means to project power across the globe in defence of her people and her territory. For a nation that many had assumed was finished as a military power of consequence, it was a startling reassertion. The Sea Harrier and the Viffing legend that grew around it became part of that story. Proof that British ingenuity, properly applied, could still produce a weapon that the rest of the world envied and feared. For the islanders themselves, the consequence was the most immediate of all. The 1800 Falklanders, whose wishes had been the heart of the matter all along, remained British by their own clear preference, a status reaffirmed decisively in a referendum in 2013 when they voted almost unanimously to remain a British overseas territory. The garrison was strengthened. A proper airfield, RAF, Mount Pleasant, was built to ensure the islands could never again be seized by surprise. The strategic neglect that had so nearly invited the invasion was not to be repeated. And what of the manoeuvre at the centre of our story? Viffing entered the lore of military aviation as one of its great party tricks. Endlessly discussed, occasionally exaggerated, but rooted in a genuine and unique capability that no other combat aircraft of its era possessed. The debate over how often it was truly used in combat continues, but its effect on the minds of the enemy was beyond dispute. And in war, what the enemy believes can matter as much as what is true. The deeper significance, though, lies in what the whole episode revealed about Britain herself. The Falklands War, and the strange little aircraft that helped win it, tells us something profound about the nature of British power, and about the dangers of mistaking the appearance of decline for its reality. For 2 decades before 1982, the prevailing wisdom in Whitehall had been one of orderly retreat. The empire was gone. The carriers were too expensive. The world was a place to be managed and withdrawn from, not contested. Britain's role, the thinking went, was to be a loyal but modest junior partner in NATO, hunting Soviet submarines and leaving the grander business of global power to the Americans. It was a respectable, sober, accountant's view of the world, and it was very nearly fatal. What the Sea Harrier story exposes is the gap between the ledger and the moment of crisis. On paper, in the calm light of a Treasury spreadsheet, the case for cutting Britain's expeditionary capabilities was strong. But history does not unfold on spreadsheets. It arrives unannounced, in the form of an Argentine landing craft grinding onto a beach 8,000 miles away, and it asks a question that no accountant can answer. When it matters most, can you actually fight? In 1982, by the narrowest of margins, the answer was yes. And it was yes precisely because a handful of capabilities had survived the cuts, almost by accident. There is a lesson here that has echoed down the decades, through every defense review since. Capabilities are easy to scrap and agonizingly slow to rebuild. The aircraft carrier you sell today cannot be conjured back into existence the morning a crisis breaks. The squadron you disband, the skilled pilots you let go, the ships you send to the breakers. These are not lines in a budget that can be reinstated with a stroke of the pen. They are the hard, accumulated substance of a nation's ability to act in the world, and once lost, they are lost for years. The Sea Harrier itself is gone now, retired in 2006 in a decision that many in the fleet air arm bitterly opposed, leaving the Royal Navy without fixed-wing carrier air power for the better part of a decade until the new Queen Elizabeth-class carriers and their F-35s arrived. The debate over that decision, whether it was a prudent economy or a repeat of the very mistake that had nearly cost Britain the Falklands, continues to this day. History, it seems, does not so much repeat as rhyme. But the legend endures. The image of that ungainly jump jet stopping dead in the air, leaving a supersonic pursuer to sail helplessly into its gun sight, has become a kind of national parable. the story of the underdog that should not have won, the compromise that proved its doubters wrong, the British knack for improvising brilliance out of inadequate means. Whether Viffing was a battle-winning tactic or a brilliant deterrent that worked chiefly in the enemy's imagination, it captured something true about the war and about the country that fought it. And so, the question is left to you. Was the Sea Harrier's success a triumph of British engineering and courage, or a desperately close-run thing that owed as much to luck and Argentine misfortune as to any war-winning manoeuvre? Were the cuts of the Knot Review a reckless gamble that nearly lost an empire's last outpost, or a reasonable bet that simply came due at the worst possible moment? I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Leave your verdict in the comments below, especially if you or someone you know served in the South Atlantic. If you enjoyed this story, do give the video a like and subscribe for more deep dives into Britain's military and intelligence history. Until next time.